Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleophas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he'd been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Let us pray. May the words of my lips and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Well, I mentioned it last Sunday, and if I had been careful and prepared ahead of time and knew what lesson was coming up next in the lectionary, I wouldn't have done it, but I tipped my hand and I told you that today's resurrection appearance from the Gospel according to Luke is my very favorite. But now I guess I should tell all of you why. You see, unlike the stories in John's account, where Jesus keeps coming back to create resurrection faith in those first disciples, first in Mary Magdalene, as he calls her by name, and then in those 10 gathered in that upper room as he breathes peace upon them and shows them the mark of the nails. And then a week later, when he returns for Thomas to create resurrection faith in him, here Jesus comes back for us. For us. This is our resurrection appearance. Notice how Jesus is revealed to his followers, these two unknown disciples, through the opening of Scripture and the breaking of bread. Sound familiar to anyone? Is it not what we do each and every Sunday when we gather together? Indeed, as if to make this connection even more clear, notice how the story is told in a 4-part movement. First, the two travelers are met on the road. They are gathered. Second, they have the Scriptures open to them. Third, they share in a meal that, as bread is broken and thanks is given, the presence of the risen Christ is revealed. And then, fourth, they go and they tell the good news. Exactly parallel to how most Orthodox Christians have worshiped from almost the very beginning. We meet, we listen to the Word read and explained, and we share a sacramental meal, and then we are sent. Now, you think all this parallelism is just coincidental? I think not. We are being told that this is where we will continue to find the risen Lord, in word and in sacrament, in the gathered community, in worship, wherever two or more are gathered in his name. And I am absolutely convinced that that is why the characters and the location of this story are so vague. I mean, this is the only appearance of Cleophas and this other disciple. Otherwise, they are entirely unknown. And no archaeologist has ever yet discovered any evidence of a town a day's journey from Jerusalem named Emmaus. Never. Ever wondered about that? I know I have. Could it be that these disciples are unknown because in truth they represent us? And that Emmaus isn't any one particular place because it is any and every place where the risen Christ is encountered. Do you see what I mean? Of all the resurrection appearances, this is ours. This is how Christ meets us. This is how Easter continues. But even beyond all of this, I find this story appealing, most especially in its realism. I mean, you can see it happening just as it unfolds. I mean, it's easy to imagine the disciples' conversation on that road to Emmaus, the two disciples carefully sifting through what they themselves had seen and what they had heard from others the week before. They are trying to discern the necessary things to help them understand what has happened and what to do in the wake of such loss and disappointment. When a fellow traveler joins them and asks what they are discussing, they list for him those things about Jesus of Nazareth that seem most important. Jesus' identity and betrayal, their hopes, and the rumors of the resurrection and the tomb found empty, just as the women had reported. Now, it's a decent summary of the important details, but this traveler finds it lacking. He reminds them at length of the promises of redemption found in the Scriptures. Yet the disciples still do not recognize that the one speaking to them is Jesus. They look, but they do not see. And perhaps the most telling phrase of their exchange with this stranger is that phrase, "But we had hoped." But we had hoped. Now, the Greek tense here implies something that began in the past but has been going on continually since. We had hoped and we kept on hoping. But the story makes it clear to us that continual hoping that Jesus was the one who would redeem Israel has now come to an abrupt end. But we had hoped. Those are perhaps four of the most heartbreaking and yet realistic words in all the Scripture. I've heard families use that exact same phrase as they were packing up their things they had brought with them to the intensive care unit. But we had hoped, they say. We had hoped, and then they go home alone. I have heard families use this phrase when addiction returns, or jobs go away, or family members disappoint. So much is said in those four little words as they speak of a future that will not be. A dream that created energy and enthusiasm but did not materialize. A promise that created hope but proved to be false. It speaks of a future that is closed off, now irrelevant, dead. And there are few things more tragic than a dead future. There's a story, and I have no way of knowing whether or not it's true, but I've heard it repeated in several different places over the years. Supposedly, there was this great literary critic who challenged Ernest Hemingway to write a gripping short story in only 6 words. So accordingly, Hemingway replied to this challenge by hurriedly writing down these 6 words: for sale, baby shoes, never used. For sale, baby shoes, never used. You see, it's not just the tragedy of what happened that hurts, but that gaping hole of all that could have been, but now will not be. You see, the Easter story, the story of Jesus, does not gloss over pain and loss. Death is not avoided, but death is overcome. And Easter is not some glib resurrection band-aid. Yet somehow, in our hectic, busy lives, we want to rush forward to resolution. We want to skip over Holy Week and the journey of Lent, or at very least abbreviate it and head straight into the joy of Easter. Or in a more secular sense, we just want to gloss over the negative. Lift up the positive. When we go out in our workaday world and a friend shares the news of the death of his sister, we sympathize for a moment, but then we change the topic. Or a coworker shares her disappointment in not getting a job promotion, and we're very quick to remind her that, well, at least you still have a job. Or we see an acquaintance who has gone through some terrible loss, and we avoid him or her because we just don't know what to say. I mean, it's not like we're trying to be callous or insensitive. We're just at such a loss with loss. We feel inadequate to the task of confronting the darkness of our lives and of our world, and so we flee in denial. And so when reading this story, we have a tendency to want to hurry ahead to that part about burning hearts in our story. Hearts on fire with the resurrection presence of Jesus? When Jesus comes and sits with the disciples at their table, takes the bread, breaks the bread, and blesses it, and their eyes are open, and they recognize the pattern of his movement. They feel the familiar pull of the holy drawing them into communion, and they are thrilled to discover that death and resurrection are deeply rooted in God's saving activity, so that Christ's crucifixion and resurrection actually fit a pattern that can be seen throughout God's dealings with his chosen people Israel. Now it can all make sense. But before there can be that recognition, those disciples first have to honestly endure that loss. But we had hoped. Just as there is no resurrection without the cross, so before there can be hearts burning with recognition and Easter joy, those very hearts are broken hearts. You see, there's more to the story than just acknowledging the cross so we can fast forward to resurrection. Here we deal with the reality of disappointment and dashed hopes. We acknowledge that part and parcel of being human is being broken. And in that brokenness, often we cannot see how God is at work. At least not right away. And so to these broken-hearted disciples, both those in today's reading and those gathered here this morning for worship, the risen Christ comes, walking alongside us on the road, perhaps astonished that we do not see as we ought to, but nevertheless, opening the Scriptures, teaching us that we may understand, sharing his presence through bread and wine, and granting burning hearts that prompt us back out into the world. But all of that starts with broken hearts, with disappointment over the cancer that has returned, with disappointment over a loved one that has died, or a spouse who has betrayed, or a child who has walked away yet again, or of a job that didn't materialize, or a congregation, or pastor that disappointed, or you fill in the blanks. This story would remind us that we have to acknowledge and perhaps grieve a future that will never be, in order that we may hear and receive the future that God has created and prepared for us. And that is why I find comfort in the Emmaus story. You see, Jesus does not leave his disciples on their own, blind to the reality of the resurrection, nor does he ignore their loss and their heartbreak. Rather, he chooses to meet them there. In their grief, they cannot see enough to go looking for him. So he finds them. He walks with them and takes his place at their table, though they do not recognize him, at least not at first. In the breaking of bread, he opens their eyes to his presence with them all along, so that disappointment, loss, grief, isolation, fear, can be overcome. Not ignored, not discounted, not glossed over, but overcome. Last Sunday's message reminded us that Easter is not just a day or a season, but an ongoing event wherein we encounter the risen Christ. Today's message tells us how that continues to happen, how Easter continues to, among, and through us. And thanks be to God. Or, better said, the Lord is risen.